We need to have answers, and that are scripturally, spiritually valid answers so that we can stand on a foundation without apology to Almighty God and say, God, I want to hold your hand, walk in the future.
To be a healer requires a willingness, an assumption, if you will, on the public's part, but a willingness on our part to be ethical in every single dimension of our practice, of our service.
Goodness is a generational phenomenon. Remember what God said to the Jews? If you keep this law, it will go well with you and your children.
From my own perspective, as somebody whose faith is very important to him, I have worried that we have not engaged the religious community in some of the serious ethical issues that are posed by the advances in this field, at least not to the degree that we need to.
I'm going to try and give just some observations, both general and specific, about the growing interconnection between money and health care. Okay. To put this in context, I would want to make an argument that the contemporary healthcare marketplace is characterized by what I would call the maturing of managed care. That is, managed care is no longer new. Its benefits and shortcomings have become fairly clear. And the degree of managed care penetration in the healthcare market, though, varies widely by geographic region. I think we in Southern California have had, roughly 80% of the population is covered by some sort of HMO health plan, which my understanding is that far exceeds the average across the country. It seems to me that managed care has essentially delivered on its promise to rein in healthcare expenditures and increase access to care, though in my view there are still far too many people without access to quality care. But it is delivered on this promise at the cost of important aspects such as patient choice, the patient-physician relationship, and at times quality. Some of the indications of the maturing of managed care includes things like continued mergers of providers, namely hospital systems and physician groups, in order to keep operating costs low enough to stay in business. Some physicians actually moving away from HMO arrangements, settling for smaller practices, less income, and fewer headaches. We just recently announced in Southern California that the St. Joseph's Health System, one of the largest hospital systems in the area, as of July 1st of 2000, was no longer accepting any more HMO patients. And this time next year, when the rest of their contracts expire, they're going to seriously reevaluate whether they want to continue in the HMO market. Third, some insurers and physician groups are actually leaving the marketplace, either voluntarily or through financial pressure. In fact, two of the largest physician management groups in California filed for bankruptcy in 1999. Fourth, the formation of physicians' unions, something I suspect many of us thought would never take place. Fifth, physicians and hospitals successfully suing insurers over denial of access to care. Sixth, surprisingly, in my view, a growing number of physicians who I talk to support now a single-payer system. And 5 to 10 years ago, I think I could have counted on one hand the number of American physicians who would have supported such a system. And at a fundamental level, at least, a reluctant acceptance of the mixture of business and medicine. This is at the general level. I want to deal with this for just a few minutes. At the fundamental level, the rise of managed care medicine, particularly the for-profit variety, has raised a growing concern about the blend of business and medicine. There is still widespread public skepticism about the ability of managed care organizations to choose the health interests of their customers when those interests conflict with the interests of their shareholders in maximizing the return on their investment. It is widely assumed in this discussion that there are two sets of ethical standards that are in fundamental conflict. The traditional medical ethic emphasizes patient well-being and the physician's obligation to the patient. This stands in conflict with the way business ethics is widely perceived, with its emphasis on profit maximization. Numerous observers have stated that at some level, obligations to the bottom line will directly conflict with duties to serve the needs of patients. One writer has put it eloquently like this: the ethical principles that promote free and fair competition are quite different from the ethical principles that preserve the integrity of the physician-patient relationship, and specifically those that protect patient welfare. Managed care organizations were created to achieve economic objectives that may be fundamentally incompatible with traditional principles of medical ethics. Even if it's possible to agree that certain principles ought to apply to managed care, the market may make it impossible to live by those principles. Okay. One more. Simply put, it's believed that there will be an inevitable and irreconcilable conflict in mixing business with medicine, because the traditional good for medicine, dating back to the Hippocratic Oath, is the health of the patient, while the good for business is profit. Right, right there. Now, in response to this, to suggest that a business ethic is only concerned with profit maximization is to misunderstand what business ethics is about. Although I do admit that the conduct of some health maintenance organizations and insurance companies around the country does reinforce the notion that all they are interested in is profit, and at virtually any cost. But I would argue that a business ethic of profit maximization as the sole goal of a business is an oxymoron, and that some health maintenance organizations and insurance companies have been acting unethically in their pursuit of profit. It is a standard maxim within most business schools in the United States that the goal of a corporation is to maximize the wealth of its shareholders. The classic statement of this is from Milton Friedman, who held that corporations were exercising all the social responsibility they needed to simply by making a profit. In doing so, they provided the public with a useful product or service and provided jobs for people in the community. Friedman further argued that for corporations to act in a socially responsible way that did not contribute to its profit was actually stealing from shareholders. Friedman's paradigm has been challenged by what is known as stakeholder theory as an alternative, which suggests that there are other stakeholders, such as employees, the community, the environment, whose interests should be taken into account along with shareholders in the decision that a company makes. Now, one good example of the stakeholder approach applied to medicine deals with the pharmaceutical giant Merck. A scientist at Merck some years ago discovered, almost by accident, that a drug the company was selling to fight parasites in farm animals could be used and adapted to cure the third world disease of river blindness. The drug being available is great news to the victims, but of course the problem for Merck was that none of its potential customers could afford to pay for the drug. Merck was thus faced with a very difficult decision whether or not to invest the money necessary to develop and to distribute the drug with no anticipation of any return on their investment. Merck had hoped to raise funding from a variety of public and private sources, which predictably failed miserably. They essentially faced the decision of whether or not to give the drug away at a cost of roughly $20 million annually. Now, they actually decided to do that, to give the drug away, manufacture it and distribute it, and the cost, this was some time ago, and the cost actually probably has risen. The reason they did so was not necessarily because they were doing charity, although I think we'd all admit that they were. But this was mission-driven in this decision. Listen to the statement of their corporate philosophy, which we have up on the screen. We try never to forget that medicine is for the people. It is not for the profits. The profits follow, and if we have remembered that, they have never failed to appear. The better we have remembered it, the larger they have been. Their mission was clearly not profit maximization at all costs. It was a service for which they could expect a reasonable return on their investment. I would suggest that this is precisely the spirit of Adam Smith, who is still widely considered the ideological founder of market capitalism. For Smith, business was considered a profession in which service to the community through your product or service was the mission, and profit was an anticipated byproduct of excellence in that product or service. That is, the service, not the product, the service, not the profit, was the end. Or to put it another way, the bottom line clearly was not the bottom line for Adam Smith. In addition, for Smith, and Dr. Patrick, I think you're quite right about this in your comments on market capitalism, it was enlightened self-interest that was the engine of capitalism. Smith never suggested, in the words of Gordon Gekko in the film Wall Street, that, quote, greed is good. In fact, I suspect he's turning over in his grave to have that phrase attributed to him. He clearly rightly distinguished between greed and self-interest, as does the Scripture. For example, Philippians 2:4 puts it very clearly. Look out not only for your own interests, but also for the interests of others. The problem there was the exclusive pursuit of self-interest, not the pursuit of self-interest per se. But more importantly, Smith assumed that individuals possessed the necessary resources to show restraint in the pursuit of their self-interest. That is, ethics and self-restraint played a critical role in the proper functioning of the market in its everyday transactions. Catholic theologian Michael Novak has put it very pointedly like this, I quote, "A firm committed to greed unleashes social forces that will sooner or later destroy it. Spasms of greed will corrupt its executives, anger its patrons, injure the morale of its workers, antagonize its suppliers and purchasers, embolden its competitors, and attract public retribution." This stakeholder approach to business ethics is also consistent with the way some of the most successful companies conduct their business. In their best-selling book, Stanford University management professors James Collins and Jerry Porras describe what they call visionary companies, that is, companies that are built to last. What sets these companies apart is their set of core values that governs their day-to-day business. They summarize their findings like this. I quote, "Contrary to business school doctrine, maximizing shareholder wealth or profit maximization has not been the dominant driving force or primary objective through the history of visionary companies. Visionary companies pursue a cluster of objectives of which making money is only one, and not necessarily the primary one. Yes, they seek profits, but they are equally guided by a core ideology, core values, and a sense of purpose beyond just making money. Yet paradoxically, the visionary companies make more money than the more purely profit-driven companies. That is, these companies operate under more of a stakeholder approach to their mission. They balance a host of competing obligations, including those to shareholders, customers, suppliers, the community, and the environment. As applied to healthcare, this model is a great improvement over the perceived view of business ethics. Business and healthcare I would argue, have consistently mixed in the past century and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. And it clearly will not do to suggest that they cannot or should not mix, or to sit back and lament the fact that they are mixing, and to think that difficulties will simply disappear. It seems to me that the task of ethics in this area is to ensure that the health interests of patients are not compromised in the legitimate pursuit of profit. Okay? Now, I want to sort of prognosticate a bit and look into the future of what the intermingling of money and medicine might look like in the next few years. Some of these things are already beginning, and actually some have been going on for some time. And I realize this kind of prognosticating is a perilous type of activity, so I prefer that, we delete this part of the tape so that nobody can come back and hold me accountable to these things a year from now. Just kidding. Now, that being said, let me suggest some areas in which money and healthcare will continue to intermingle. Some of these clearly are macro issues that will be resolved only with broad changes to the current healthcare delivery system. These are issues that deal primarily with what we call distributive justice. That is the philosophical and theological debate over how the goods of society should be distributed. Healthcare delivery is simply the most recent debate that has questions of distributive justice at its core. That is, questions concerning the criteria by which healthcare is distributed, whether it be need, merit, social worth, ability to pay, or some combination of these. These are at the heart of the current discussion of healthcare reform. I would want to make the case that the door is wide open for both theologians and philosophers to bring reflection on distributive justice into this debate. Now, let me highlight in the time we have left here, 6 different trends that either have begun or are coming in the next few years. Okay? Here's the first. Okay. Society must rank its priorities in healthcare delivery. In my view, the current healthcare system is attempting to do the impossible. That is, it's trying to achieve 4 goals simultaneously that cannot all be maintained due to a scarcity of resources to devote to healthcare. These 4 goals are universal access, high quality of care, cost control, and freedom of patient choice. At present, I would assess the healthcare system under managed care achieving these goals in roughly this way. Access has increased, but there still are far too many people without access to the healthcare system. Quality of care is generally good, and patients are, even in most HMO plans, are basically very satisfied with their health care until they become seriously ill. And then it's a very different story from that point on. Third, cost control has improved. It seems to me that managed care has essentially delivered on its promise to control costs, though it does appear to me that managed care has done about what it's going to be able to do in squeezing the fat and the waste out of the healthcare system. It seems to me that in terms of cost containment, managed care has done about what it's capable of doing. One of the ways we can tell by this is that in the last 2, maybe 3 years, most HMOs have announced anywhere from 8 to 12% premium increases in order to pass on higher costs. And then finally, I would suggest under managed care, patient choice is significantly limited due to a variety of factors, not the least of which are the frequency with which people change jobs or employers change their health plans. Okay? Now, it seems to me that we first need to admit that the scarcity of resources for health care is real and not imagined. In the 1980s and early 1990s, there was consensus that health care costs were spiraling out of control and, if not contained, would consume a disproportionate share of society's resources. This was due to a variety of factors, including overuse of expensive high technological treatments, particularly at the end of life, the legacy of aggressive treatment, and the phenomena of third-party payers that removed patients from payment and rationing decisions. Managed care emerged as a solution to these cost containment problems and as such has likely run its course. There actually has been some movement away from things like capitation as a mechanism to control costs, though I suspect that capitation as a payment mechanism for physicians and hospitals is probably here to stay as long as healthcare is distributed on something resembling a market model. We're also seeing HMO enrollments that have flattened out over recent years. Senior HMO enrollments have essentially gone flat, and the price difference in premiums between PPO and HMO arrangements has significantly narrowed in the last few years. We're seeing much more growth in PPO arrangements that allow for greater choice, both on behalf of patients and benefits. And I think that Dr. Swenson actually is quite right that the future of employer-based medicine or healthcare coverage, where employers will be picking up the lion's share of an employee's healthcare coverage, will not too long be a thing of the past. Okay? Second, I think we need to address the issue of whether healthcare is a right or a commodity. And I'd refer you to, in the absence of further time on this, I'd refer you to the Center's publication, The Changing Face of Healthcare, which has a number of good pieces on this very subject. Let me just summarize some thoughts on that here in the next minute or so. The more that market mechanisms are used to control costs and ensure quality and access, the more healthcare is regarded as a commodity that can be purchased and sold in the open market like any other service or product. Of course, healthcare is fundamentally unlike most other products or services due to the immense knowledge differential between patients and physicians and the urgency of securing health care when one becomes ill. I haven't seen too many people who are inclined to comparison shop when they get sick. And I think that makes it fundamentally different than the way we comparison shop for other products. However, there is some parallel to legal representation, which is generally just as urgent generally considered a market service except for the realm of what we call public defenders. Actually, this is similar to the way society views other necessities such as housing, food, and education. These are generally distributed according to the market and according to one's ability to pay, unless one cannot afford it, at which point a minimal standard is provided through public housing, food stamps, and publicly subsidized health care such as Medicaid and Medicare. I would acknowledge there's a clear difference in quality between the two tiers in the current health care arrangement. And even this lower tier has access problems and issues of cost control. Witness the federal government's continuing ratcheting back Medicare reimbursements to physicians and hospitals. What does strike me about unique about the way healthcare is coming to be regarded is that people view it as a positive right to all the health care they need regardless of their ability to pay. It is perhaps the only service on the market today where people expect everything they need without ever having to worry about paying for it. Now, a second trend that I think is worth pursuing here for a few moments is the change in how the traditional medical ethic is being viewed. I'd like to suggest that we ought to think about moving from simply considering the interests of individual patients only to a consideration of balancing. We need to go on here. One more. Go ahead, one more. Balancing the interests of individual patients and the patient population being served. A number of commentators have written very thoughtfully about this. The traditional medical ethic has put the patient's interest ahead of virtually every other consideration. This ethic, it seems to me, has implicitly assumed that resources were not an issue and that there were no other legitimate competing interests other than those of the individual patient. But with managed care bringing scarcity of resources to the forefront of society's attention, physicians' obligations became divided. With payment schemes such as capitation in place, there was the prospect of a conflict between the patient's best medical interest and the physician/hospital's financial interests. The ethic of this seems to me clear, that the fiduciary relationship between patient and physician demands that the physician put the patient's interest ahead of his or her own self-interest. And the overwhelming anecdotal evidence from the physicians that I come into contact suggests that that's precisely what does take place. Further, some physicians consider it very reasonable to disclose to patients when there might be a conflict of interest. For example, the urologist that I go see has a sign right on the front desk of his reception desk disclosing that he has a financial interest in the lab that's right next door to which he refers all his laboratory work. And I, as a patient, I appreciate knowing that. Some have even gone further, calling for physicians to disclose the way in which they are paid for patient care when you are the patient. That strikes me as a bit unfeasible due to the multiplicity of payment arrangements that are currently in place. However, the more difficult conflict raised by scarcity is the conflict between the interests of individual patients and the entire patient population being served by the physician or the hospital. With a fixed amount of resources available to treat a patient population, there's a possible conflict between the interest of the patient population and the interest of individual patients. This is particularly acute under a system such as capitation, where the physician has a contractual obligation to care for the entire patient population for which he or she has under contract. And a given patient who utilizes a disproportionate share of those resources, particularly if the care is futile or marginally beneficial, jeopardizes the ability of the physician to provide a proper level of care for all of his or her patients. Of course, the degree to which the physician is compensated by capitation will determine how acute this conflict could be. There is less of a conflict when payment is made under a PPO arrangement, though the physicians that I've talked to do lament considerably having to see far more patients and deal with far more administrative detail in order to maintain their income. Let me suggest a third that may be somewhat controversial. And that is, I think what we'll see in the future is physicians and hospitals more regularly saying no to families who request futile treatment at the end of life. Virtually every day in hospitals and medical centers around the country, families make inappropriate requests for aggressive care at the end of life. More often than not, at least in my experience with physicians, more often than not, physicians accommodate these requests out of a fear of being sued or to avoid a predictable and often high amount of tension with the family. The result is that resources are unnecessarily spent at the end of life on futile or burdensome treatments for patients when the cost is very high and the benefit is minimal. In the future, I think you will see physicians and hospitals saying no to these kinds of requests, and in many cases for the right reasons, for a proper stewardship of scarce medical resources. To be sure, there will be cases in which aggressive treatments ought to be continued at the end of life. But in many of these cases, there is clear consensus that aggressive treatment ought to be stopped and a regimen of palliative care be initiated. One of the directions where I think this is going is in the state of California. As of July 1st, just a few weeks ago, a new law in California gives physicians and hospitals the right and immunity from liability to say no to these requests. These are requests that are particularly deal with requests that are contrary to a hospital's policy, violate the standard of care, or violate the dictates of the physician's or hospital's conscience. In my view, this will empower physicians to refuse unreasonable requests for end-of-life aggressive treatment. The law puts it like this. Quit in the next slide. I quote, "A healthcare provider may decline to comply with an individual healthcare instruction or healthcare decision if the instruction or decision is contrary to a policy of the institution that is expressly based on reasons of conscience. A healthcare provider or institution may decline to comply with an individual healthcare instruction or decision that requires medically ineffective healthcare or healthcare contrary to generally accepted healthcare standards applicable to the healthcare provider or institution." Now, if you want to see, I've got the entire text of the law. It's close to 40 pages and makes me glad, Sam Casey notwithstanding, that I didn't go to law school. I would suggest this is a coming trend and will enable hospitals to be better stewards of their resources. In my view, it is unethical for families to request futile treatment, particularly to request treatment that is more burdensome than beneficial for their loved one. Again, in my view and my experience, some of these requests are tantamount to torture of their loved ones in the name of, quote, doing everything. I've never done this, but I'm going to someday. I've often wanted to suggest that attending physicians require families who make such requests to observe at the bedside the treatments that they are authorizing. For families to see what is being done to their loved one under the guise of doing everything, in my view, could be a very powerful deterrent to requesting futile or burdensome treatment at the end of life. Now, the one way in which patients can help, it seems to me, with tension in this area, is to refuse futile or burdensome treatment at the end of life. We should consider it virtuous for a patient who wishes to refuse an aggressive treatment at the end of life because it would be too costly, either to himself or to his or her family. I find it odd that it is only with illness does a patient acquire the right to have his or her interests be the only ones considered. Normally in families, individual members weigh the interests of other family members with their own. In fact, it's rare that any family member would require or expect that his or her interests are the only ones that matter. In fact, the term we would use for that generally is selfish. In fact, I'm trying desperately to teach my children, who are approaching teenage years, that the world does not revolve around them, and that in a family there are competing interests that must be weighted carefully. Why should this be that different at times of illness. To be sure, the vulnerability of an ill person merits them perhaps having a heavier weighting of their interests, but it should not exempt them from weighting their interest against the interests of the rest of the family. In those cases in which continuing aggressive treatment would constitute a crushing burden to one's family, we should consider it virtuous to refuse such treatments. To say that there is a duty or an obligation to refuse such treatments is taking it too far, since such a duty would constitute a claim on the ill person that could be exercised by one's loved ones. That has the great potential to be coercive and should be rejected. I'm not suggesting here that there is a duty to die, and I admit that I am very nervous about the combination of market medicine, managed care, and assisted suicide being legalized. Not so much because of the potential for abuse, and frankly, I'm not sure that Dr. Swenson's scenario that he suggested will come to pass, but for a more insidious reason, that it places the terminally ill and the elderly in the very unenviable position of having to justify their own continued existence. And that seems to me is fundamentally incompatible with somebody having the right to life. Okay? A fourth trend, and been heavily involved in this for the past couple of years, is ethics committees giving increased attention to organizational ethics. In the last few years, ethics committees have been asked to shift their focus from strictly clinical ethics to those that deal with the business side of healthcare. These include aspects of a healthcare organization such as billing, marketing, admission, transfer, and discharge policies, joint ventures and affiliations with other healthcare institutions. I sit on the organizational ethics committee for 2 large Catholic hospitals in Southern California, and we have had some very sticky wickets when it comes to joint ventures and affiliations with non-Catholic institutions. The Joint Commission for Accrediting Hospitals has shown much greater interest in the last 2 to 3 years in this side of an ethics committee's work. Increasingly, the ethics focus in healthcare will be on the organizational side of the house, where money and morality mix more frequently and much more intentionally. It seems to me that those who are involved in ethical reflection in hospitals and medical centers will be asked to more explicitly blend business ethics and medical ethics, to formulate an ethic that will serve both patients and serve the organization that serves the patients. It seems to me it would be in the interest of the bioethics community to become better educated in the sister field of business ethics in order to better serve their institutions. One more. Fifth, it seems to me that gaming the system will continue. Though there have always been temptations to manipulate the healthcare system for one's personal gain, under managed care there have been opportunities and much greater pressures to work around the system in order to ensure not only the most profitable reimbursement, but also the patient's best interest. For some physicians and hospitals, upcoding is a more time-efficient way to secure that which they believe to be medically necessary for their patients. Some physicians I've spoken with are convinced that the only way to maintain their viability in practice is to regularly game the system, because as currently constituted, they do not receive adequate reimbursement to stay in business. The alternative to upcoding, they claim, is to spend countless hours advocating for patients either by phone, fax, or letter. I'm told by case managers in hospitals of the temptation to exaggerate the accounts of a patient's illness and course of treatment and to falsify diagnoses in order to obtain reimbursement or authorization for further treatment. This seems to me has become particularly problematic under managed care, which has tightened the requirements on physicians and hospitals for authorizing treatments and reimbursing procedures. Changes in the system clearly will present new opportunities to circumvent further attempts at cost control. I want to make the case that gaming the system is morally problematic precisely because of the deception that it involves. This has been in significant discussion in the medical literature just in the last 6 to 9 months. There was a major piece in the Journal of the American Medical Association, 4 or 5 articles on lying for patients, and a major study that was published in the Archives of Internal Medicine in mid-1999 on a study of physicians' inclinations to lie to third-party payers in order to benefit their patients. I would suggest there's a subtle difference between writing the narrative of a patient's course of disease and treatment dramatically and falsifying the diagnosis in order to receive authorization or reimbursement. Such falsifying is deception and under the law constitutes insurance fraud. Numerous physicians have given anecdotal evidence that gaming the system is not necessary to achieve a good outcome for one's patient. Clearly, it does save time and headaches. But if a physician is willing to go through the proper channels, their experience is that it usually pays off, making gaming the system unnecessary. A further problem with gaming the system is that it's fundamentally discriminatory. That is, one must be selective about the patients for whom one games the system. For clearly, if a patient did this for all patients for whom he deemed it necessary, he would no longer be able to do that because the scheme would clearly have been detected. Okay? Finally, there must be Christian concern for the poor and those without access to the healthcare system. In my view, again, most of the difficult issues in this area have to do with access to care for the uninsured or underinsured. Though it is true that some people are under or uninsured by choice or temporarily, while in between jobs providing coverage, the majority of the un- and underinsured would be very vulnerable if hit with a serious illness. This is particularly the case in states with large immigrant populations such as Texas and California, in which immigrants come from cultures that tend to view health care as an absolute right. Vulnerability will also extend to the rapidly swelling ranks of the elderly who will qualify for Medicare in the next 20 years, as us baby boomers, many of us in this room, reach retirement age with a declining workforce available to provide support. Now, regardless of the way one looks at the macro issues that are involved and how they are resolved, an integral part of the healthcare system, particularly if the trend toward the market continues, will be the provision of care for the poor from charitable and religious groups. Market forces should not be allowed to force physicians and hospitals away from providing a degree of charity care, though I admit that current market pressures do make that very challenging. Capitation, for example, has eliminated the phenomena of cost shifting, which was used for many years to provide care for the un- and underinsured. Especially for Christian physicians who follow in the tradition of the healing ministry of Christ, the biblical mandate to care for the poor is a powerful one. It seems to me that our Catholic brothers and sisters are surely onto something with their overwhelming ethos to care for the poor. My hope is that the not-for-profit healthcare sector continues to be financially viable. For I fear for the poor if all healthcare becomes dominated by the for-profit sector. We have already seen a dramatic increase in what we call cherry picking, which is the decision to insure only the people who are least likely to need healthcare in the future. Christ's admonition to care for the vulnerable surely applies to the poor when they hit that most vulnerable stage of illness and decline in their health. Thank you.